Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I have to begin by congratulating President Free because I don't know if you realize what an accomplishment it is to get John Durham to come to a public forum other than a courtroom and speak about A, himself, and B, his work. It's no surprise that there are, I counted, at least 3 members of the press here tonight because they probably realize this may be their only chance ever to hear John speak about his work other than in the courtroom. He's notoriously shy about speaking about himself or what he does. I suppose, though, that part of the reason that John agreed to this is because it is the University of St. Joseph. Because other than an overwhelming commitment to the cause of justice, the 2 great devotions of John's life are his Catholic faith and his family. He's married to his wife, Susan, whom we all refer to simply as Saint Susan. And they have 4 wonderful sons and now recently their 8th grandchild. Of John's sons, all of whom I'm very fortunate to know, 2 of them are prosecutors. His son, John Jr., is an assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of New York. And his son, Reed, is an assistant state's attorney, and I'm happy to say working at the chief state's attorney's office, investigating and prosecuting cold cases. John's other 2 sons, Patrick and Daniel, could they be any more Irish? If they had another son, he would have had to been Seamus. Patrick and Daniel chose more honorable professions and are not lawyers, but there are 2 young Durhams to carry on John's legacy. I think if you spoke to members of the bench and bar about John and asked, well, how would you describe John? What are the words that come to mind? The first one, and the one that's most important for any lawyer, for any of us, is integrity. John's integrity is beyond question. If a judge or a lawyer asks John a question, they may not like the answer they get, but they can be assured that that answer will be the same tomorrow as it was today, that it will not be the subject of public opinion or whims. John is true to his word always and completely faithful to it. I think the second thing that you would hear about John is his extraordinary work ethic. You need only look at what's in the bulletin for tonight to see the amount of work that John has done in his career. It's taken him throughout the United States. At any time, and I mean truly any time, from the earliest hours of the morning to the latest hours at night, John is either in the office or at his home with his computer, answering emails, filing pleadings with the court, or he's on his cell phone taking calls from young prosecutors, sometimes old prosecutors, asking him questions because John has earned the reputation at this point in his career that he's the person you call. Those of us in the legal field, and I see Judge Droney here, and I know that he could certainly attest to this, after a while in this field, you get fairly comfortable with what you're doing, but every now and then you run into something that just stumps you. You haven't seen it before. John Durham is one of those very few people in the state of Connecticut who you call when that happens. And I don't mean just prosecutors or law enforcement agents. I mean judges, defense lawyers, civil practitioners. People understand what John has done in his career. They respect his impeccable judgment, and they look to him for advice because they can trust him. The third thing that would probably come to the fore if you were to speak to other members of the bench and bar about John is his attention to detail. Like all great lawyers, John has an incredible attention to detail. He has an uncanny ability to identify and develop the smallest of facts in a way that he can then weave those facts together to create a tapestry that can be presented in court that accurately and honestly reflects the circumstances that are before the court at that time. It's interesting, though, because that attention to detail doesn't apply to every aspect of John's life. And the one aspect that it really kind of doesn't work for is his choice of attire. Now, like a lot of people of a certain age, John wears a suit to work every single day. Dark suit, white shirt, modest tie. You would think it wouldn't be that hard, right? Because when you buy the suit, you get the jacket and the pants together. They come together, and you just wear those 2 things, and you really can't go wrong. John seems to have an unfailing ability, however, to mismatch the jacket and the trousers. His wife, St. Susan, has even gone to lengths of putting tags on the clothes so that John can match the jacket and the trousers, yet he still gets it wrong. He goes off in the early morning hours before she can see him go out the door and he doesn't quite get the opportunity to assess the ensemble that John put together that day. And it can sometimes result in some embarrassing situations, such as when he's standing in a courtroom, and only then, as he's addressing the jury, does he realize that that particular day he wore the gray striped jacket with the navy blue checked pants. And I've often wondered if, because we don't know what jurors do or talk about in the jury room, but I've often wondered if those jurors ever say, you think that guy does that on purpose? Because everything else he does seems to make a lot of sense, but the jacket and the pants just don't work. I don't know. I don't know what it is, but it's the one thing that I can say that John doesn't have together perfectly. I think that one of the things that we look to in lawyers is, what are they all about? What do they mean for themselves? And I think we all, as lawyers, like to call ourselves by the finest of names, and we like to talk about what it is that motivates us. And I can assure you, having now known John for 30 years, that when you hear about the tough prosecutor, which John surely is, ask any lawyer who's ever been against him in the courtroom, we sometimes conjure this image of some hard-bitten person who just wants to pound everybody and wants to be the tough prosecutor, usually on the cases that are the easiest. That's not John Durham at all. John understands that the full force of the law doesn't have to be brought on every poor person who happened to stumble. But what John does understand, and what motivates him every day, is that the rule of law is what provides us the freedoms and the liberties and the luxuries to live the lives that we all aspire to, and to have created the greatest nation on earth. And every time I've spent time with John talking about a particular issue, it is so clear and so obvious to me that the motivating force, the reason that he's working day and night all around the country, is so that the most vulnerable people in our society understand that the rule of law will protect them. And whether it's a young mother on Edgewood Street in Hartford who simply wants to be able to send her child out to the bus stop with the same comfort and safety as a young mother who lives in Avon or Simsbury, or whether it's a person who's toiled 30 or 35 years in a factory or on construction sites and simply wants to know that the person to whom he entrusted his retirement won't steal it from him and leave him and his family destitute. Those are the people that motivate John. And those are the people that John understands the rule of law is there to protect, and that he, as a prosecutor, has the solemn responsibility to make sure that it does offer that protection to them. We like to call ourselves by a lot of names in the legal profession, sometimes sort of highfalutin, but two phrases that you sometimes hear are that prosecutors or lawyers, judges, like to call themselves ministers of justice or guardians of the law. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you, my friend, the Minister of Justice, the guardian of the rule of law, United States Attorney John Durham. Thank you.
So I know it's a little dark here, but I assure you my jacket and my pants do match tonight. I want to thank President Free and the university community for inviting me here to speak tonight. As Len indicated, we've been associated for, I think now over 30 years. I've been a prosecutor for 40 years. So that's 36 with the Department of Justice. And with respect to being a federal prosecutor, one thing that I try to bear in mind, I think we try to encourage new young prosecutors, particularly those prosecutors that are making their bones or cutting their teeth, is an awareness of the incredible power that is wielded by law enforcement, and perhaps federal law enforcement in particular. Issuing a subpoena, we can destroy somebody's reputation, we can damage their business, we can hurt their families. And it is an awesome power that we have that should be used appropriately in all instances. Now, this flies a little bit in the face of the sort of constant demand that the public has for information. We're going to talk about a particular matter this evening, this demand for immediate information and the like, or people in the public thinking they understand cases and try to figure out why hasn't a prosecution been brought, why weren't more charges brought, and the like. But it is with this awareness of the power that we do wield and the ability to really destroy people that we try to exercise in the United States Attorney's Office, Chief State's Attorney's Offices, hopefully always, to wield that power appropriately and with limitations. To indicate that with regard to the investigation of certain kinds of crimes, things that make movies, television series and programs and the like, there's a real keen interest in violent crime and the like. And as part of the law enforcement tools that we have, a very powerful one, particularly for investigating organizations of violent individuals, whether they're gangs or, in this instance, the Irish Mafia up in Boston, the LCN, the Cosa Nostra. With respect to those kinds of investigations, it is true that oftentimes the only way you can actually attack those organizations is through the use of informants. But they're at best a two-edged sword, as I'll discuss in a little bit. The damage that can be done when law enforcement or prosecutors misuse these tools is difficult to overstate. And we unfortunately have seen it in some recent instances. There are particular cases that never make it to the public. The public has an awareness of an investigation, but not the outcome of the investigation. So I want to just start, before we look at this particular presentation, talk about what is it that federal prosecutors have to bear in mind when they're conducting investigations. Number one, it is as important for the system for prosecutors to protect the secrecy of proceedings, not because we want them to be secret, but because we're not always right. Maybe accusations that are lodged against somebody that are untrue. And again, we can destroy that person or the persons if that information gets out. We operate under a set of principles which say to a prosecutor, you're only authorized to bring a prosecution if you believe, based on the evidence that you have, that you are likely to be able to prove a case, not probable cause standard, which is all that's required to arrest somebody, but if you believe that you'll be able to prosecute the case and prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt. And beyond that you'll be able to sustain that conviction on appeal. And if you can't say, in all honesty, that you'll be able to do that, then prosecution is not warranted. And there's a lot of frustration surrounding that in a lot of instances. When on the nightly news, we're watching what Bob Mueller is doing and so forth, there's a great desire for that information. But however that investigation turns out, whatever Mr. Mueller and his colleagues conclude, if it's not satisfactory, if it's to the satisfaction of the public, it may very well be because Bob Mueller is an honorable person, an honorable man, and applies those principles of law as he's been taught and as he's taught to others. So how do we run amok? What are the instances or examples we can look to point us in the right direction and avoid heading in the wrong direction? We have here reference to this PowerPoint, use of informants, a cautionary tale related to John Conley. Now, Len Boyle didn't mention this, but Len Boyle was a principal part, maybe the principal part of the investigation in Boston relating to the FBI corruption, or alleged corruption in Boston. So what I intend to do is to run through the Conley matter, the Bulger matter, and then an associated case to give you some idea of what it is that prosecutors and agents and police officers have to deal with, and the kinds of moral decisions they need to make in the process. So if I can have the next slide, please. So John Le Carre said in the Russia House, some things are necessary evils, some things are more evil than necessary. And that was a fundamental question in what was going on in Boston in connection with the FBI and Whitey Bulger and Stevie Fleming. The next slide. So who were the principal players in Boston? And what was really at play in Boston? Well, the main players were Whitey Bulger, who many people have heard about, read about in life, Stevie Fleming, and then John Connolly Jr. So with respect to these individuals, if you go to the next slide, in the early days, right? There's a quick background on some of these individuals. Whitey Bulger, his older brother Billy Bulger, they grew up in projects in South Boston. And Billy Bulger was older than John Connolly, and John Connolly was about the same age, in the same vicinity as Whitey, although Whitey too was a little bit older than Connolly. And so they knew one another from when they were kids in the projects in South Boston. Now to the south of where they lived was Stevie Fleming. Stevie Fleming was from an Italian-American family, and his associations principally ran to the LCN, the Italian mafia. And then with respect to the individuals involved in this, we go to the next slide. A key player was William Bulger. A key player in respect that William Bulger had first been elected to public office in '61, is a former president of the Massachusetts State Senate, and then former president of the University of Massachusetts. With respect to Mr. Connolly and the Bulgers and the South Boston connection, it's probably a little known fact that John Connolly was initially not hired by the FBI. He was turned down, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the backgrounds of some of these people were key to what would happen. Now, in the 1960s and in the 70s and 80s, actually, the principal flagship program for the Federal Bureau of Investigation was its investigation of organized crime, La Cosa Nostra, the mafia. And for an FBI agent, the way you would really make your bones and be a big person on campus would be if you worked those kinds of crimes and if you had informants. And in fact, for a long period of time, the FBI, you got judged, rated. How many informants do you have open? And the sort of most important type of informant they had was what was referred to as a top echelon informant. We can go to the next screen. So Whitey Bulger had been convicted of a bank robbery, sent to federal prison. Prior to the more immediate events, that's the only time he had been convicted. He would eventually take over what was known up in Boston as the Winter Hill Gang. It was the Irish gang in Boston. Stevie Fleming, as I indicated, he had ties not to the Irish so much as to the mafia. And in fact, he became partners with a future New England LCN crime boss, Frank Salemi. So that was their background. You go to the next slide. John Connolly, as I say, he grew up in South Boston. He was hired by the FBI in 1968 with a little help from his political friends. As indicated, Connolly, his initial application to the FBI, he was turned down. But with respect to his having eventually been hired, there's due in no small part to a letter that was sent by then Speaker of the House John McCormick from Boston, talking about to John, as in J. Edgar Hoover, speaking to Mr. Connolly as being a fine example of young American manhood. So Connolly gets hired by the FBI. So at that point, '68, he knows the Bulgers, didn't really know Fleming at that point, but he's now an FBI agent. We can go to the next slide. In the early or mid-1970s, Connolly ends up making his way back to Boston. Now, curiously, one of the ways, maybe the principal reason that Connolly is able to get back to Boston is, as some of you may know, the FBI, you typically could not get back to your home, your home base for years and years and years, and particularly get to Boston. Very difficult to get to Boston. You have to have many years in the Bureau. Connolly happened to arrest Frank Salemi. Salemi was not the boss of the family at the time, but Salemi was supposed to meet Stevie Fleming in New York. Only John Connolly purportedly always carried a picture of Salemi, an LCN guy, saw him on the streets of New York, arrested him, and as part of his reward for making that capture, he gets transferred to Boston. Now, Connolly's forte was not really investigating cases. That is, he wasn't doing bank robberies or white-collar crime or the like. He had some interest in organized crime, and he had an interest in informants. So he makes his way back to Boston, and as the evidence of the case that we tried against Connolly reflected, Connolly approaches Billy Bulger, who he appreciated for his political help and the like, asked Billy Bulger what he could do for him to thank him for all the help he had provided to him in his growing up. And Billy Bulger's response was, keep my brother out of trouble, meeting Whitey Bulger. So around 1965, if we go to the next, 1975, if we go to the next slide, Connolly, in fact, does recruit Whitey Bulger to serve as a top echelon informant with the FBI. Now, at that time, Whitey was well known to law enforcement. He was part of the underworld. His power base was South Boston and the Irish gangs, involved in extortion, gambling. He taxed drugs in the sense that he had this Robin Hood image that Whitey kept the drugs out of Southie. Really not true based on the evidence that's developed largely by the state police in Massachusetts and the DEA. That no, he didn't keep the drugs out of South Boston. Rather, he would impose a black tax. Anybody who wanted to deal drugs in South Boston and other places had to pay the freight to him and his colleagues. So he's recruited as a top echelon informant by John Connolly around 1975. Now, when we go to the next slide, it's Stevie Fleming. Now, Fleming, he had actually been recruited by the FBI back in the mid-1960s by a bank robbery squad. So it was not initially organized crime that he was providing information about. But he had the Italian heritage. He had the contacts with the Boston or New England, or before that, the Patriarch LCN. So he was very important to the FBI, and he eventually became an organized crime informant, became a top echelon informant, and John Connolly was his handler. Now, I note in this slide that Fleming had been a fugitive himself for a while. He and Salemi had blown up the car of a defense lawyer. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but essentially a lawyer was representing a guy named Joe Barboza. Joe Barboza had flipped, and he had given up information on a lot of people in the LCN. Old man Patriarch wanted retribution to the lawyer for cooperating Barboza, and so Fleming and Salemi put a bomb in the lawyer's car, blew the car up. The lawyer, fortunately, had left the driver's door open, so he lost a leg, but he survived the explosion. But it was leaked to Fleming and then to Salemi that there were warrants that were going to come out, or indictments. And so he fled for a number of years before he was whistled back by an FBI agent after the coast was clear that they weren't going to be able to actually return the indictment and make that case. So what was the formal understanding or the formal deal? If we go to the next slide, the reality was that both Bulger and Fleming were notorious, really bad actors in Boston when they were recruited by the FBI to serve as informants. And so, we passed regulations and we put all kinds of policies in place. The FBI had plenty of regulations and plenty of policies in place about signing the person up, advising them as to what they can and cannot do as an informant, what their exposure is if they engage in additional crime, and so forth. So for formal purposes, that's what they were told. All the paperwork was signed and the like. The sort of discussion that supposedly had occurred between Connolly and then Bulger and Fleming was they would give up information on the LCN, and so while the LCN was playing checkers, the Irish would play chess, and they would do the LCN and take them down. And again, in context, the number one priority of the FBI at the time, in all honesty, was taking down the LCN in the United States. And so Bulger and Fleming were then informants. What was the real deal that was going on, unbeknownst to most people in law enforcement? Well, Bulger had used, and his family had used his family connections to further his criminal enterprise. As they were getting more information, they were providing. And John Connolly, as the evidence of the trial that Money and I tried showed, had assisted Bulger and Fleming by compromising the gentleman in the lower right-hand corner there, who is the organized crime squad supervisor, John Morris. This was not speculation that he was compromised. He eventually ended up admitting to the fact that he had taken expensive cases of wine, he had taken cash money on multiple occasions, and was compromised then by Bulger and Fleming, and they had the keys to the kingdom of all organized crime information in Boston. And the next slide, please. Eventually, the Massachusetts State Police and the Drug Enforcement Administration principally conducted an investigation which resulted in the indictment of Stevie Fleming, Whitey Bulger, Frank Slemmy as head of the LCN, and others. And the theory of the racketeering case was that there was this joining of forces between the LCN, the Irish mob in Boston, the Italian mob, and the Irish mob. So the LCN and the Winterville people joined forces. They controlled all of the drugs, the loan sharking, extortions, and so forth that were going on in the cities. That was the theory of the prosecution that was initially brought in, the first indictment that was returned. So what happened? That investigation involved, well, it was principally DEA and Massachusetts State Police. The FBI was involved in it. So we can go to the next slide. In late December of 1994, they were getting ready to indict the case. There was concern that maybe some information was getting out, so they were going to get criminal complaints before they got an indictment, and they were going to go round up and make the arrest of all the principal people, including Fleming and Slemmy and Bulger. Well, Fleming was arrested. He was on his way out of Boston, but he was arrested. Frank Slemmy actually made it out of Boston, and he was a fugitive for a number of months before he was apprehended. And as many of you are familiar with Whitey Bulger, he fled, was a fugitive for 16 years. He was looked for all over the world, all over the United States. He was on the FBI's top 10 fugitive list. There was a $2 million reward for him. And one time that was the second highest reward offered by the FBI for anybody other than Osama bin Laden. Well, during the course of the proceedings then, because recall, as I just said, Fleming had been arrested along with the other people who were in the racketeering indictment. So there was a proceeding that took place before Judge Mark Wolf in Boston, and it went on for, I think it was 7 months or thereabouts. What eventually came out was a claim by Steve Fleming, and seeking a motion to dismiss the racketeering indictment, that he had been told by the FBI supervisor, John Morris, that you can commit any crime you want so long as you don't clip anyone, so long as you don't kill anyone. And so the indictment that was returned that had extortion and illegal gambling and loan sharking, use of violence and so forth, his claim was that he and Bulger were authorized to do that. They were informants for the FBI, and so long as they didn't kill anybody, they were authorized to do it, which in criminal law, not to get into the weeds, but it's called public authority defense. Hey, we were authorized to do this. That was the nature of the defense that was initially raised in support of the motion to dismiss the indictment. If you go to the next slide, so during as I say, that proceeding lasted before Judge Wolf, before it ever even got to trial. For some 7 months, there's a motion to dismiss. Again, as an FBI informant, the claim was that Morris and Connolly that told Fleming and Bulger they were authorized to commit these crimes. Interestingly, during the course of those proceedings, Connolly himself was subpoenaed to come in and to testify in hearings. He's called by the prosecutors, Freddie Weishak and Brian Kelly, who did a fantastic job in the investigation and the prosecutions that followed. But Connolly, now retired from the FBI, asserted his Fifth Amendment privilege. He goes outside of the courthouse steps, holds a press conference where he makes all kinds of statements about this outrage and the like. And so then naturally defense attorneys recall him because they argue, well, now he's waived his Fifth Amendment privilege. He's made these public statements. Connolly once again asserts his Fifth Amendment privilege, which the court recognizes and will not compel his testimony. So it's kind of the backdrop to what ultimately became the Justice Task Force. So Attorney General Reno and Director Free of the FBI at the time wanted these matters investigated. It was quite the scandal that was going on up in Boston. And so we were asked to go up there because he had some familiarity with New England LCN and knew some of the judges, knew investigators, and so forth. So the Justice Task Force was then formed to investigate corruption involving the FBI and others. Well, that investigation, the investigative part of that matter took place. It took probably the better part of a year. You know, the next slide. And as the result of the hard work of FBI agents from outside of Boston, so they were conflict-free, and the work of Lenny and the others, we ended up indicting Connolly for obstruction of justice, essentially, and racketeering. That initial indictment named both Bulger and Fleming as defendants in the case, and then we subsequently superseded that indictment for some technical reasons. We can go to the next slide. So in that superseding indictment, we only charged Connolly and Fleming. They were charged with racketeering, RICO, additional acts of obstruction, and this is Mr. Connolly in his defiant state talking to the press. Skip ahead. He wouldn't testify in front of Judge Wolf in the matter, the initial RICO indictment had been returned in Boston. He didn't testify at trial after he had been indicted either. So again, what was it that the evidence showed in this case? And I said this is not a bit of background about the use of informants and how careful law enforcement needs to be. Bulger and Fleming, they were essentially the top of the underworld. The LCN was under great attack. We had indicted a number of people down here in Connecticut, about half of the principal players, and the New England family. The other half was indicted in Boston. So they were in disarray. And Bulger and Fleming were really running the criminal operations in Boston, while they were top echelon informants for the FBI. And so while they were working for the FBI, they committed a number of murders. They had a number of older murders. They controlled drug trafficking in South Boston and the like. Ultimately then, the initial indictment basically being dismissed, a new indictment brought, naming Bulger and Fleming, in which 21 murders were charged. Any number of which were alleged to have occurred while they were working as top echelon informants for John Connolly and the FBI. If you go to the next slide, this is just that picture that was in, I forget it was in the Herald or the Globe, but they outline the murders that were charged in that indictment that included racketeering, extortion, and whatnot. And the racketeering indictment included 21 murders. And there are a couple of people I'll come back to in a moment. You'll see basically in the middle of this slide on the screen you're looking at is a fellow named Roger Wheeler. And then in the upper right side, the second item down, was John Callahan, that I'll talk about in a moment. But those were 2 of the 21 murders that were included in this indictment. So the case was tried in Boston. It was a unique experience for me, both Lenny and myself, because I'm sure in the movies and television you see, well, the prosecution is at one table, the defendant and the defense at the other table. The trial judge in this case actually let Connolly sit in the audience with his wife during the length of the trial. He never even came to counsel table. He was permitted to do that. But during the trial, as I indicated, John Morse ended up having to testify, compelled his testimony, and he admitted to having taken bribes from Bulger and Fleming while he was a supervisor with the FBI. Next headline, these are headlines from the press up there, said, "Oh brother," Johnny Monterano, the person in the lower right-hand corner, he testified that Billy Bulger, according to Fleming and to Whitey Bulger, he testified that he'd been told by Bulger and Fleming that Billy Bulger had asked Connolly to watch over Whitey and take care of things. Monterano testified in our case. Monterano testified in the case after Bulger was apprehended, and he admitted murdering 20 people himself. Which again, in terms of the kinds of tools that you use, the kind of power and authority you have, you say, man, how can you use somebody to testify who admits to having killed 20 people? These are difficult judgment calls that come up in these matters. The 20 people that Monterano had killed, by and large, there were no cases to be brought. That is, there were no leads. There was no way to solve any of those cases. But when Monterano found out through the hearings in front of Judge Wolf that Bulger and Fleming had been informants for the FBI, he was furious, and he agreed to cooperate. And so part of his cooperation was he would admit to everything that he had done, but he wouldn't get prosecuted for those murders that wouldn't otherwise go unsolved. And after much consideration and deliberation, including waiting in the Attorney General of the United States on the matter, ultimately a decision was made, all right, make the deal with Monterano on these unsolved homicides, and it's not just now you can solve them, but there are families, right? You can go to the families, you can explain to the families, but we would typically go to the families to talk to the family members and see, this is what we have, what do you think? And so the decision was made, okay, we'll use Monterano. It's a very difficult decision, but that decision was made. And so Monterano testified for us and then against Bulger later down the road. You have the next slide. During the course of the trial, again, now these guys are informants while this is going on. Kevin Weeks, he was another right-hand sort of person to Bulger in particular, who had been charged in the original indictment from Judge Wolf, who also decided to cooperate and testified for us in the trial against Connolly and then subsequently against Bulger. And Weeks did say that with respect to Whitey Christmas, that Whitey would talk about the fact that Christmas was for cops and kids. So they'd make payoffs to police officers, and they would make payoffs, they claim, to multiple or number of FBI agents, including Morris and Connolly. Christmas was for cops and kids. And then there's a headline up there at the time talking about the big tipper. And so Frank Salemi was the head of the family. Frank Salemi was charged in the initial indictment. When he finds out that his longtime criminal partner, Stevie Fleming, and Bulger were informants, he sends his lawyer to talk to us, saying he's willing to testify. He'll tell you what he knows about how it was that he and Whitey Bulger got the heads up to flee. And Salemi wanted nothing in return. He wasn't looking for a deal, he wasn't looking for time off, he wasn't looking for some kind of promise of sentence. In fact, with regard to Salemi, when he was interviewed at one point, he was asked about a murder, he denied any involvement in it. He had no promises on that, and he had subsequently been indicted in connection with that murder because there was no deal beyond him coming in and telling us what he knew. And Salemi then testified how he had gotten the word that an indictment or arrests were about to come, and the way this all came about was that John Connolly had gone to Kevin Weeks, told Kevin Weeks that the FBI was about to arrest people. Weeks then tipped Fleming, Salemi, and Bulger. Fleming thought he had, and I'll talk about this in a minute, he had other inside information that he was going to rely on as to when this was going to happen, so he didn't flee, and he got pinched almost immediately when they had the arrest warrants. Fleming believed that he fled, and as we know, Whitey Bulger took off and was a fugitive for some 16 years before he was eventually arrested. And then the court, as we indicated, the press is able to say things a lot more colorfully than we're permitted to say them in the courtroom. But this particular headline from the Boston paper is probably accurate. Once angry, Connolly cowers in the courtroom. They say Mr. Connolly elected not to testify, which he had a constitutional right to do. And it worked out the way it worked out for Mr. Connolly. So we can go to the next screen. With regard to Connolly, he would have names for his informants for Bulger and Fleming, code names how they were referred to him, but they similarly had a code name for him. There's testimony that then came in at trial that Bulger and Fleming's reference for Connolly was they would talk about Zip. And while Mr. Connolly elected not to testify at his trial over the prosecution's objection, the trial judge, who was actually, he was a very good trial judge, and he was fair to, I think, both sides. But over objection, he allowed the defense to play a training film that John Connolly had made as a young agent down at Quantico in the FBI about how to handle informants and how treacherous informants can be, and never trust informants, and on and on and on. So Mr. Connolly elected not to testify in his own defense, which probably, as it turned out, was a mistake. Next slide. Because Mr. Connolly was then was convicted of obstruction of justice and racketeering, and as the Boston Herald so poetically put it, Zip was zapped. What was the aftermath of the Connolly trial? Bulger's still a fugitive, and Fleming new indictments when he returned. Well, we did what the government typically does. There were new Attorney General guidelines that were put in place, required a new and more stringent suitability reviews. Prosecutors under the AG guidelines get a lot more involved in it. That is, the FBI couldn't have informants. They were engaged in major kind of criminal activity or associated with major criminal actors without getting a sign-off by a United States attorney and the like. Discovery obligations changed a little bit. That is what the prosecution and the government is required to disclose to the defense in connection with informants. So that's the story that everybody knows, right? Largely, a lot of that is known. I'd like to focus attention a little bit, though, on what I refer to here as the other largely untold story. It involved an individual by the name of Richard Schneiderhan, who was a Massachusetts State police officer and retired. Now, we also, Lenny and I and the agents and whatnot, saw an indictment from the grand jury against Mr. Schneiderhan. With respect to Schneiderhan, he had worked for the Massachusetts State Police for 25 years. He had retired, and then he went to work for the academy NESPIN, which was a regional organized crime clearinghouse. Everybody knew him. All the organized crime information from Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, you name it, was centralized in a fashion at NESPIN, and that's where Richard Schneiderhan went when he retired. So he had access to all kinds of information, sensitive information. Again, by way of his background, the next slide, he had joined the state police way back in '59. He was with the Massachusetts Attorney General's Organized Crime Unit. He rose to the position of Chief Intelligence Officer. But he had a secret relationship that nobody in the state police or the FBI knew about. And we searched his house and came across a letter that he had written to his son, where he indicated that if he ever got himself into a jam, the son should contact Paul. And then there was some contact information for Paul. And so he ran that investigation out, and of course Paul turns out to be none other than Stephen Fleming. So while the FBI had its problems, its significant, serious problems with Connolly, it's also the case that the Massachusetts State Police had some problems. In fact, the evidence reflected that Schneiderhan had been tipping sensitive investigations to the Winter Hill people, Stephen Fleming in particular, for over 20 years. There was a particular event that had occurred in Massachusetts that had the state police and the FBI and other investigative agencies up in arms, looking at one another, where they had placed a bug. The state police had gotten a bug in the Lancaster Street garage in Boston. And they thought that this was going to be the motherlode because they had Bulger there, they had Fleming there, they had people bringing them bags of money and the like. And they were very confident this was going to result in finally getting Bulger and Fleming, only for that operation to be compromised. Well, it turns out it was Richard Schneiderhan, not somebody in the FBI, but Richard Schneiderhan, who had compromised that investigation and many others. Well, what was it that Schneiderhan was doing? In the fugitive investigation looking for Whitey Bulger, had gotten various federal orders to try to track telephone calls and whatnot. And some of those orders were related to Bulger, William Bulger, who was then the president of the University of Massachusetts, and then Whitey's other brother, Johnny Bulger, who was then court magistrate of the juvenile court in Boston. And he, Schneiderhan, leaked out information that authorities were trying to locate Whitey using various tracking devices on the phone. So Billy Bulger and Johnny, we go to the next slide. And he did it through the same fellow, Kevin Weeks, the same person that Connolly had gone to leak the information that the federal indictment was about to come out. Schneiderhan went to the same person, provided that information to Weeks, and then Weeks, in an attempt to protect his boss, Whitey Bulger, then passed that information on to Billy Bulger and Johnny Bulger. All the while, Schneiderhan, retired Massachusetts State Police officer for 25 years, Nesbitt and whatnot, he knew the Bulger was wanted on racketeering charges involving multiple murders. So then we ended up having to indict Mr. Schneiderhan, but it was all in the family with Schneiderhan as well. Because as the investigation played out, we were able to determine that Schneiderhan's niece, Linda Reardon, she worked for the telephone company. She had access to the information about the pen register orders, the track and trace orders, the tracking orders for the phones. She gave them to her father, Ed Duff, who was the brother-in-law of Schneiderhan, and then Ed Duff gave it to Schneiderhan, and the information was passed to the Bulgers. And so that investigative effort was compromised. You know, you think about some of these things, what's in the minds of some of these people, because after all, both Connolly and Schneiderhan, they were police officers or agents in the Mass State Trooper. Well, I said we had searched Schneiderhan's house, and we came up also with a separate letter that was to the son, again, to go to Paul, who was Fleming, in which Schneiderhan wrote in his own hand, "Tell Fleming, I said that I will save him a cool rock to sit on. When he gets down among all the fire and brimstone, he'll have at least one friend down here." So who knows what goes through the minds of some folks. Ultimately, the result of that investigation, if you go to the next slide, is that Reardon and Duff both pleaded guilty. Schneiderhan elected to go to trial, and after trial, he was sentenced. He was convicted of conspiracy to obstruct justice and obstruction of justice. And despite his age and his background as a police officer, he was sentenced out of prison. So we go to the grand conclusion to this particular epic. And that, of course, involves what happened to Whitey Bulger. Well, ultimately, the Bureau was successful. The FBI was successful through the use of a really pretty clever bit of information they put in the press. They did it intentionally, hoping that somebody would report information they could follow up on and the like. And in fact, somebody did see the show where this was advertised, did call the FBI. The FBI then conducted a very quick investigation, confirmed that it was Whitey Bulger, who was out in Santa Monica and proceeded to arrest him. Bulger had been living in this apartment building in Santa Monica for in excess of a decade with a woman who had taken off with him. Whitey had a lot of women that he was friendly with. He had left initially with one woman. Apparently that relationship wasn't working out, so at one point in time he actually came back to the Boston area, dropped her off, and then picked up Catherine Reed, who then spent the next 16 years with him on the lam, as it were. So that's where Bulger was in that apartment building in California for some lengthy period of time. When warrants were obtained for his apartment, there was over $800,000 in cash, which was found hidden in the walls of his apartment. There were approximately 30 handguns that were in the apartment or in the storage area. There were various kinds of throwing knives and killing knives and the like, all of which was recovered as a result of the search of that apartment. Bulger was brought back to Massachusetts. Probably a lot of people followed that in the press, but ultimately he was convicted on 31 out of 32 counts on a racketeering indictment, including 11 of the, they found proven 11 of the, I think it was 21 murders that were in that indictment. That case was tried by Fred Wyshak and Brian Kelly and a younger assistant who did an unbelievable job. He was convicted of money laundering, extortion, weapons offenses. He's currently serving 2 consecutive life sentences. He was ordered to pay almost $20 million in restitution, and $22.5 million was forfeited. So there is an epilogue to this story. So after Flemmy saw the handwriting on the wall, Flemmy decided that he would cooperate. He's not interested in going to any of the places because people had been murdered in Florida, and they had been murdered in Oklahoma, where the death penalty was alive and well. Flemmy decided that he would cooperate with investigators. And based on a lot of information that had been gathered by the Justice Task Force, and then by the Massachusetts State Police, the DEA, and then with Flemmy's information, John Connolly ended up being charged by state authorities in Florida with second-degree murder. He was ultimately convicted after trial for that murder and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Remember that slide earlier that showed you that they had like 21 or so people were killed. They said, well, the person in the middle was of that earlier slide was Roger Wheeler. The person in the upper right-hand corner was John Callahan. So Roger Wheeler owned World Highline. He lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he had highline interest here in Connecticut and down in Florida. It was believed that Wheeler was pressing to have an investigation done, internal audits and the like, of World Highlight down in Florida, and that the skim that was coming out of the highlights and coming to the Winter Hill people, that he was going to find this out. So he had to go. He was at his country club, had finished playing 18 rounds of golf, walked to his car, was about to get in the car when Johnny Martorano, a person who looked kind of nefarious in one of the earlier slides, something like John Belushi, walked up to Mr. Wheeler, shot him literally between the eyes, split his glasses, and he was dead. Investigation was then ongoing for a long period of time, including here in Connecticut, because of the World Highlight facility here up in the Hartford area. John Callahan was a Boston CPA who, for whatever reason, liked the fast life and was running around with mobsters in Boston. He ended up being the president of World Highlights down in Florida. There were various investigators, including from Connecticut, but not limited to Connecticut, who were after Callahan, trying to get Callahan to cooperate. The testimony and evidence relating to John Connolly as to Callahan's murder reflected the fact that he, Connolly, had told Bulger and Fleming that Callahan was weak and that he was likely to fold if he was pressed by investigators. So Bulger and Fleming took that information. Johnny Moderano was signing out in Florida at the time. They told Moderano what had to happen, and Johnny Moderano shot and killed John Callahan in Callahan's own Cadillac down in Miami, and left him in the trunk of his own car at the Miami International Airport. That's what Mr. Connolly was convicted for in the state court, and he is presently serving that 40-year sentence in Florida State Prison. So I started out by talking about a cautionary tale, and it is clearly the case that law enforcement officers, agents, prosecutors need to bear these kinds of events in mind in making the decisions I talked about earlier. Do you use informants? How do you balance the public interest in those cases? To what extent do you have to satisfy yourself that the person's information is adequately and independently corroborated? And if you can't satisfy yourself of that case, then you have no business using informants in these kinds of high visibility, high stakes investigations. So that's the cautionary tale. I'd be glad to take questions that folks might have about this matter or others. This is much easier than I thought it was going to be. Yes. Yes, sir.
Billy Bulger being the president.
Billy Bulger being the president of the Senate in Massachusetts and also the chancellor of the university system, did he really not know where his brother was? I find that very hard to believe. And if he did know where his brother was, why wasn't he prosecuted?
The information that's in the public domain on that is that Billy Bulger at one point was called before a congressional committee. There was questioning done on that subject matter. And Billy Bulger said that after his brother became a fugitive, he talked to him on only one occasion. He'd gotten a call from Whitey. Whitey, told him that he wasn't going to be able to talk to him anymore, wouldn't tell him where he was, and it was his congressional testimony that that was the one and only contact he had with him. So, as I had indicated, you do these kinds of investigations, there's a lot of information that might come to your attention. But if the information is not sufficient to be able to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt, you're kind of stuck there. You might think a lot of things, you might suspect a lot of things. You might be frustrated that you need, a little bit more information to be able to charge somebody. But if you don't have the evidence, you just don't have it. But yeah, the thing with Billy Bulger's house in South Boston, Stevie Fleming's parents' house was right behind it. They're basically on the same piece of property. There's a sidewalk connecting them. And the Flemings, Stevie Fleming's parents, they had like a little garden house out back. And at a particular point in time, the state police executed a search warrant at the parents' little garden house, and there was an arsenal of weapons there that were seized. That presumably did not belong to his elderly parents. But there is information in the public record about Billy Bulger going over, as neighbors will, to the Fleming's house, the Fleming's parents' house and whatnot. So how much did he know? Probably a lot more than we could prove, but that's speculation. Yes?
Kind of two questions here. One, roughly, how many federal cases are prosecuted that include the use of informants? Is it a vast majority? I don't expect an exact number, but is it a vast majority or a very, very few?
I would say it's a relatively small number. We typically see the use of informants. They're in complicated organizational or enterprise kinds of cases. Harvard in this area. My principal office is in New Haven, Bridgeport. You go to any major city, currently significant majority of shootings that are occurring or not are being done by really violent people. And your average citizen just will not testify against those people because they're justifiably afraid they're going to be killed, their children will be killed, and whatnot. And so if you want to investigate those kinds of organizations, like the Mafia or the Winter Hill Group or the Latin Kings, or you name your criminal organization, if you're going to investigate them, ideally you can get to the point where you can get a court to order or authorize wiretapping. So you then don't have to rely on scared citizens, understandably scared citizens to testify. You can gather the evidence to convict a person based on their own words. But it is most oftentimes the case, the only way that you can get to wiretap is through the use of informants. So in violent drug cases, organized crime cases, extortion cases, those are the types of matters that there are going to be informants that you use. Now, the law makes a distinction between informants and cooperating witnesses. And sometimes you'll read a newspaper article that talk about, this person who is a co-defendant testified. So informants are people that, a common understanding of informants in law enforcement is they're people who are going to provide information with the expectation they're never going to be identified. They're not going to testify. They just provide you the information, and then you go out and do the investigation. Whereas cooperating witnesses are persons who, maybe it's for money, maybe it's because they're trying to work off some kind of charge that they themselves have, looking for some consideration at the time of sentencing. Maybe they're just good citizens and they're fed up with what's going on in their communities, who actually come forward and testify. But we're talking here about informants, people whose identities, by design, are never going to be made known. So, most cases, they're not involved in it. You're looking at violent crime where people are terrified. The only way you can make those cases, in most instances, is through the use of informants.
The influence of New York regionally. I'm 50 years old, so the Bulger case was, or his damage, if you will, was done prior to me, being actively interested in reading the newspaper, for instance. So the research or the searches that I've done is he was a nasty human being. But the influence from New York, say, in a comparison, was he as big and powerful and as, I can only think of nasty, mean and nasty, as like Big Paul Castellano or the Bonanno family. Certainly, I would think like Sammy the Bull and John Gotti, but was he on a much smaller scale than them, or was it as large of an enterprise as New York?
Well, in Boston, Boston obviously is a significantly smaller place than New York, city of New York. But in Boston, they control pretty much everything up there in terms of gambling, drugs, murders, use of violence, extortion, loan sharking, and the like. But Boston is a small place. In terms of nastiness, it's one of the interesting things that I think when we were up in Boston, there are any number of people that would say, "Yeah, Whitey was something to be afraid of." But there are a lot of people in Boston, particularly in South Boston, who you would be afraid of. People that Whitey himself would have been afraid of. They were just as nasty and vicious and violent. So, I'm not sure. Among the persons that they murdered up there, there's one that they had tied him up and they pulled all of his teeth out while he was still alive, trying to get information out of him before they killed him and the like. So, it was pretty psychopathic. I guess it's hard to judge who's more psychopathic, but they're nasty people.
Thank you. How safe do you feel in your work?
Again, I'm pretty harmless looking, right? So I'm okay. The truth of it is, I think that people who are involved in this kind of work, I don't worry so much. Personally, I don't worry so much about like the mafia. I mean, there are some actual rules there, right? You don't bother to shove his families, that sort of thing. I think that, speaking for myself, but I'm sure for a lot of other prosecutors, the person you're really worried about is the person you don't know about. Somebody who's just crazy for some reason. They're not announcing what they're doing, and they're not an obvious threat to you. So one of my sons, Lenny mentioned, one of my sons is a federal prosecutor. He's prosecuting these MS-13 people, and that causes me concern for him. But yeah, this is something I've never really thought about.
So thank you very much for being here. So I think you've investigated some cases related to international terrorism, and I'm wondering to what extent you think that there's a connection or engagement between international terrorists and organized crime in this country.
There's an awful lot of attention that's being paid to that, but it's not something I could comment on here. I'm sure to the extent that a lot of organized crime, whether you're talking about the Cosa Nostra, or you're talking about MS-13, you're talking about other groups that are driven by money. I mean, to the extent that that's the motivating factor is greed and money. I'm sure that there are people who terrorists can get to in that fashion. But I can assure you that the amount of attention that's being given to the terrorist matters, I think would be, if not comforting to you, I think you would be glad that the government's doing as much as they have. When you look at the FBI has, in every field division in the United States, has a pretty significant portion of their agent and analyst resources dedicated to international and domestic terrorism. But those are exactly the kind of ties that you look for.
Did this investigation really decimate the Winter Hill Gang, or do you think that there's any evidence or of the like of a resurgence of this?
It's an interesting and an interesting thing. As I said, that the FBI, the Justice Department, Bobby Kennedy set up the strike forces to go out to mafia in the 1960s, and they did a fantastic job. I mean, it took a while, but the Cosa Nostra is nothing today like it was. One of the consequences, however, is that the sort of concentration of criminal activity in an organization becomes much more diffuse, much more difficult to address in some ways. Maybe they don't carry the same weight and have the same reach that the mafia does, or that the Winter Hill people had, but it's still there. But the LCN, it's a shadow of its former self, as they say. With respect to Winter Hill, there's still illegal gambling and drug dealing and so forth that's going on, but it is nowhere near what it was. I mean, Johnny Monterano, his brother Jimmy, they are convicted. There's a lot of attention that's been given to them, continues to be given to them. Kevin Weeks, he went to prison. He was released. Everybody knows who they are. Everybody knows that they testified. As a result of having testified, they're much less likely to be trusted by other criminal associates. As if, if they turned on Whitey Bulger and Stevie Fleming, they could turn on me. So the Winter Hill group, it was decimated and not likely to return to anywhere near the strengthening power that it had.
A comment and a question. The comment is, I don't know if you know that University of St. Joe's boasts a very well-known woman FBI agent who was among the very first women who was ever admitted to the FBI back in, she graduated in '69. Her name was Sheila Horan.
She's just young. She's graduated in '69. She's a youngster.
Yeah, 69. And my question was, do you have a recommendation regarding, your presentation was excellent, thank you so much. But I'd love to read more about this, and do you have a recommendation about books for lay people who are interested in this
Yeah,
presentation.
there's literally a small cottage industry of authors who have written on this. So, one of the initial books that was made into, I think, a movie was Black Mass. So Black Mass is a book. If you look up the name Shelley Murphy writes for the Boston Globe, and she's, I think, written 2 books, or co-authored 2 books. If you Google Kevin Weeks, I think, wrote a book. So there are a number of them out there. As I say, a small cottage industry that came out of this. I'm sure that the Boston Press is really disappointed that this is all coming to an end, because it made for great writing.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.